Guys, one truth is that illness never sleeps. Doesn't matter whether you're flying in a plane, a train, a ship across the ocean, somebody's gonna get sick. Now, these emergencies I personally responded to about half a dozen times, mainly on flights, but also once on a train. And what I'm hoping in this episode is to go through what it's like responding to these kind of emergencies, what's the most common, the 5 most common that might affect you on your flight, and some of the challenges in providing this kind of in-flight care. All right, so let's start with the 5 most common in-flight medical emergencies that could affect you on your next trip. Number 1, the most common by far, is fainting at 37.4% of cases. And it's not surprising to consider that, considering that you're up in the air, some people haven't had enough sleep, you might have missed a meal, you're discombobulated, the cabin is tight, it might be too hot, too cold, whatever, you're scared. All these things can cause you to feel faint. So that's number 1, the most common one. Number 2 is feeling breathless. And again, this could be related to anxiety, nerves, flight fear, etc. But that's seen in about 12.1% of cases. Next up, number 3 is nausea and vomiting, and that's in about 9.5% of cases. And again, that doesn't seem far-fetched considering you just come off a resort, people have been drinking for the last week, suddenly they're on a plane, they didn't eat properly, etc. Number 4 is heart symptoms, so palpitations, chest pain, all that kind of stuff. That's in about 7.7% of cases. And then lastly, in the common 5 would be seizures, which is 5.8% of cases. And I personally have never seen that on one of the flights I've been on. It's usually been complaints of chest problems, breathing problems, or nausea and vomiting especially. Okay, so with that out of the way, now let's look at some of the challenges that we experience in delivering care on a flight. All right, so the first problem on these flights with delivering care is space and privacy. Because you're trying to deliver care to somebody, you're in the middle of an aisle, it's cramped, there's not a lot of space, it's completely alien to what you're used to in typical day-to-day in a clinic or in an ER or whatever in delivering care. So the first problem is space and privacy. I personally remember on trying to respond to some of these cases, it is very unnerving having hundreds of eyeballs eyeing you while you're trying to look after somebody. Everybody's looking not necessarily out of maliciousness, they're just generally interested, would like to be able to help, but it's still unnerving. So the privacy thing is definitely a concern because it's not like you can put somebody to go and lie down somewhere in the plane. There's usually not enough space. There's hundreds of eyeballs looking at you. They're generally interested, they would like to be able to help, etc. But it does make it a little discombobulating and a little bit unreal or surreal trying to provide care under these kind of conditions. And in terms of trying to be able to conduct an examination, it's not exactly feasible to tell somebody, hey, lift your shirt, let me get a listen under the hood. All right, the next big problem is staff. So generally when you're delivering care in a clinical setting or an emergency room or operating room, you usually have a bunch of ancillary staff working with you. It's a team effort. Now, the problem is on a plane, you don't have a sweet clue who you're going to be working with. I remember on one flight where they called for assistance from any healthcare personnel. I was lucky enough, one of the guys that got up to assist was an ER physician, so I felt okay, all good there. But I remember on the train ride, it was a neurologist and me. From what I remember, this was something with somebody feeling kind of upset in their stomach, maybe the nausea and vomiting kind of thing. And that was just way too simple for this guy. He didn't know where to start. I would have been lucky though if it had been a seizure or somebody had a stroke. He would have been the perfect guy to have with me. Another case I remember responding to, I was lucky enough that there was a nurse on board and I was having trouble picking up the guy's blood pressure. She came along, did it lickety split, no problems whatsoever, and I was like, respect. So it's a real crapshoot who's going to be on the flight with you when you're called on to respond. And then I've had other cases where there was no one else but me on the flight. I remember that in particular with a small child. All right, the next issue that can be a problem is lack of tools and equipment. You also have a lack of medications. So very often the med bag on these flights will have in something like adrenaline for allergies, maybe aspirin for heart attacks. but it's definitely not a comprehensive med bag or kit like what you would expect in a clinic. There's usually a blood pressure cuff and stethoscope, but other than that, there's a real paucity of different tools. So you're not going to have your full repertoire of what you're used to in your own clinic. So in addition, it's also not tools that you're familiar with. You now have to be using a stethoscope you've never used before, and they're all slightly different. So it can be a real mess and jumble as well. They usually have all these things folded into a kit just like you would have in the back seat of your car. Everything's all mashed together and jumbled, and then you have to go and fiddle through and try to find what you're looking for. Again, not ideal. All right, the next big issue or challenge in delivering care is these environments are extremely noisy. As I mentioned earlier, with that case where I was trying to listen to a guy's blood pressure and I couldn't make it out because all I could hear is the rumbling of the engines. So noise is an issue that you have to contend with. It's also hard to hear what the patient's saying. And then another thing is also turbulence. So it can be rough. So you can be shaken up, you can be rocked around, and this makes for a very difficult environment to deliver healthcare in. All right, the next big one is communication and language. So far, I've been lucky that this hasn't really affected me because I'm usually traveling within English-speaking communities. So the problem with communication is, say for example, I was on a flight to Japan and I can't speak Japanese. If somebody's sick there, it's difficult for me to communicate with the hostesses, the air hostesses, even the ground control, and also with the patient, asking them, well, what's wrong with you? What are your symptoms, etc. Well, that's very hard to do if I have to do sign language. Next big problem can be infection risks. If somebody has influenza or something like that and you're responding to it, it's kind of hard to find PPE. You don't have a big gown and a bunch of masks and stuff that you can put on. You can't put on a respirator. If you're not wearing glasses and somebody coughs on you, you can contrast stuff through droplets in your nose and eyes, etc. So there's always an omnipresent risk of contracting some kind of infection as well. All right, another big one is litigation risks, the law. So some people might be wondering, well, how do you deal with somebody suing you after the fact? Well, first off, the law is very complex when it comes to airline flights because you're constantly traveling over different time zones and different legal waters, depending on which country you're flying over at the moment. But in general, most jurisdictions have something called a Good Samaritan clause, which states that if you try to help somebody in good faith, even though you were not able to provide care to the normal standard of care that would be expected on the ground in your own clinic, they try not to hold you liable for literally being a Good Samaritan because you're not being paid for these responses. And as I've outlined, there's a lot of challenges in delivering care, and you're actually not obligated to go and help someone. You could just sit in your chair and refuse to respond. So unless you actually do something extremely egregious, like putting a tracheostomy in somebody's throat when they were clearly motioning you, leave them alone, or they actually verbally said, I'm okay, unless you do something really off the wall like that, you're generally gonna be okay legally. In addition, on one or two of these flights that I've helped out on, they actually had a phone where I was able to talk to a medical team on the ground. So that also helps to disperse some of the risk legally in terms of providing care to someone, because then it's not just you, there's a team that they would have to go after. But generally, most people are good-natured and are happy to have had somebody help them. So in the cases I've been involved in, I've never had a personal problem. I'm sure somewhere in the world there's going to be somebody who was a Karen and that tried to chase after a physician that tried to help them, or a nurse or paramedic that tried to help them. But I'm not aware of any cases that were successfully prosecuted. All right, and then the final problem with delivering care is, as I've said before, it is extremely stressful for those involved. So for example, I'm already tired, I'm on a flight, I might also be connecting between flights, so I'm already exhausted. I also don't have my thinking cap on. None of my tools are there, so none of the usual muscle memory and triggers that I would have to know, oh, I do A, B, C, D, all that's gone out the window. Then there's a whole audience watching as you're trying to perform whatever it is you're doing to try to help this person. It's noisy, so it's hard to get a history from them and hear what they're saying. So I personally have found it very hard and not very pleasant, but it's something that is necessary to do to help somebody else who's in trouble. Luckily for me and the people I've been involved in so far, I've never had a case where we had to actually land the flight prematurely because of somebody going into arrest or having a stroke or something of that nature. But it does happen. So guys, that's all about providing in-flight emergency medical care. I hope you found this interesting and a good insight into it. And thank you for watching, and you're welcome.